Okay, so today we're going to look much more closely at Marx's critique of capitalism, which hopefully will, clarify some of the points we made last time about the role of inequality, the role of exploitation, the role of the state, the necessity of revolution, the role of the class struggle, and some of these other things, which all, really stem from Marx's understanding and analysis of capitalism. So, to begin, we're going to look at the creation of surplus value under capitalism, which will become very important in a moment. But before we do that, we see that all class divided societies have this aspect of surplus, which is always produced um, through exploitation. So we saw it in our examination briefly of slave societies when we looked at, say, ancient Greece, where we saw a large portion of society was enslaved, typically war captives, and it was their labor that produced the wealth of society that allowed the other classes to, enrich themselves, whether it be the agricultural labor or the mining of the raw materials. The point is that the wealth in the urban societies, the wealth of the landowning classes, and so on, would not have existed if it weren't for this foundation of slavery, um, where basically the slave was purchased for a price, and then they were able to extract an enormous amount of wealth from them afterwards. Similarly, in feudal societies, it's no longer a slave, but it's a serf or a peasant. Um, Typically would have some sort of plot of land. They would have agriculture growing, and the products of that would go to feed themselves and their family, but then everything over and above that was paid typically to the landlord in the form of taxes in some way or another, and that was the source of enrichment for the ruling classes of feudalism, the surplus produced by the peasantry. Now, under capitalism, the creation of surplus value is really the sole purpose of production, right? The only reason to participate in the capitalist economy in the form of an investor, a capitalist, is to create profit, to create surplus value. What you see in this little cartoon here is, some sort of questioner questioning the boss, saying, "What did you tell that man just now?" "I told him to work faster." "How much do you pay him?" $25 a day. "And where do you get the money to pay him?" "I sell products." "Who makes the products?" "Well, he does." "How many products does he make in one day?" $100 worth. "Then instead of you paying him, he's paying you $75 a day to tell him to work faster." "But the machines belong to me." "And how'd you get the machines?" "I sold products and bought them." "And who made those products?" "Shut up, he might hear you." So anyway, this is a classic kind of 1930s labor cartoon, which really essentially is going to explains in cartoon form what we're going to look at more closely. But before we do that, I think it's a useful way of looking at this is through a completely different example, which we can look at in cotton production in the slave plantations in the South. Okay, so this example comes to us from the book The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. Um, and it's quite useful because it looks at the cotton gin and its impact on slave production and cotton production in the slave South. Typically, the story goes something along the lines of, the cotton gin is created, and then it allows for, a rapid advancement in cotton production, and all these new slaves are needed, and it takes off from there. It sort of starts from the machine as being the main piece of innovation and change. Now, this story is partially true, but what Baptiste has to say about it, the half that never has been told or isn't told very often, is much more interesting. And so, what Baptiste focuses on is, so if we look at this chart here on the left that he makes for us in the book, he says, prior to the cotton gin, is our sort of starting point, and look how cotton production starts to take off afterwards, in terms of just benchmark numbers. massive increase afterwards, and then basically almost a doubling every year. Okay, but what Baptiste points out is, however, these numbers, though they keep increasing, don't correspond to an increase to the same proportions of slaves. So what a cotton gin does is it separates, all the cotton gin does is separate the cotton from the seed. And it's attached, super strong, takes a lot of effort to pull it apart. You cut your hands open, and it takes too long. And what the cotton gin does is it industrializes that process and separates it rather quickly. Okay, but notice, just because you have a cotton gin doesn't mean you have more cotton. You need raw cotton to be picked in order to put it in the gin. So what Baptiste wants to focus on is, well, what about those that picked the cotton, right? Not those that were working the gin. The gin just separates it from it, right? And what he shows is that over the course of this time, the actual, he has the mean daily pounds of cotton picked per slave, referring to them as workers, also goes up, right? So the cotton gin didn't have anything to do with the raw cotton being picked, right? So more cotton is being picked per slave, which is why, the numbers of slaves are increasing during this time, but in nowhere does it correspond to the rate at which the total amount of cotton is increasing, right? Yes, slavery is increasing, but not in direct proportion to the quantity of raw cotton being sold. So how do you explain it? Well, what happens is, Baptiste points out, is the output per worker, per slave, goes up. So how does that happen? Well, they have to work harder. And what Baptiste shows, what's horrifying, but it's important to point out, is that the way this is done is basically through getting slaves to work faster through, various means of torture, and the, more frequent use of the whip and so on. And so what we can gain from this example is that the amount of surplus generated by the slaves, that is the amount of wealth that the plantation owners were able to collect, is directly related to the amount of output they got for the workers, from the slaves themselves. If they were to work slower, they would have got less from them. If they were to work faster and harder and get more from them, then they make more money, and that's exactly what they did. So the way to meet the growing demand of the cotton gin, that is to get that more raw cotton, the way it was done through increased exploitation of the slaves themselves to get them to do more work in the same amount of time, through forced coercion and brutality, of course, in this case. This is what he focuses on, is the half that's never been told, much more to it than that. But what we can gain from this example is that this shows the basic ingredient for the creation of surplus under capitalism, is that in the same way as what you're seeing under slavery, is that more wealth can be generated when more is extracted from the slave. Similarly, more wealth is generated from the worker when more labor is extracted for them without having to pay any more for it. So all of this will bring us to the labor theory of value, which we'll go over in detail now. Okay, so surplus value, I said earlier, is the sole purpose of production under capitalism. But under capitalism, it's a far more kind of developed and far more extensive than what I just described under slavery. But what's the same is, yes, it's still generated. It's generated by the working class, the exploited class in this case, and it's still appropriated by the ruling class. But the process of creating it is what's different. It's a different process than what we see under slave societies and under feudal societies. But in order to understand it, we have to look at this overall concept of the labor theory of value, some of which we'll see we've kind of introduced in a certain fashion when we went over Locke. So several key technical terms are necessary to go over to get this little piece. All right, so first we got the commodity. Okay, so what is a commodity? It's a product, right, under capitalism that is produced, in order to be sold or really exchanged on the market, right? It's something that is produced precisely for the purpose of being exchanged on the market. Whether it's shoes, soap, tables, whatever. All right, that's a commodity. Okay, then Marx insists on understanding two different ways that a commodity has value. Okay, so one obvious value is what he calls use value, what we might call utility. Commodities have to have utility, otherwise no one's going to want them. They have to be useful in some way. So the use value is just the way in which something is useful. Shoes are useful for comfort or protection, soap to be clean, blankets for warmth, right? Well, workers, we'll see in a minute, they are a commodity and they're useful because they can perform labor. Okay, so that's use value, the way in which something is valuable because of its usefulness. So commodities have use value. In addition, commodities have an exchange value. Now, this is the definition of it. We're going to have to explain it, though. So for now, it's just a technical placeholder. But the exchange value of a commodity is what we'll call the amount of socially necessary labor that it takes to produce the commodity. Okay, so, but in general, the exchange value of a commodity is, the value of a commodity, the value that a commodity has when it is being exchanged with something else, So if we're going to exchange, for example, these tables on the market that we produced, we need to know what the exchange value of the tables are. How do we know whether we're getting ripped off? Is it equivalent to this? Is it equivalent to that? What is this exchange value of the commodity, right? And so Marx understands that the way to sort of explain this or understand it is that what an exchange value is, it's to understand what all commodities must have in common that enables them to be exchanged in the first place, right? So the idea here is if we're going to compare two things, say tables to jackets, or a pound of cabbage to a pair of shoes, they must have something in common, otherwise we can't compare them, right? But the problem is they have an infinite number of things that they have in common, right? They have size, color, weight, shape, etc., all of these things. But none of these traits help us compare them as commodities, as things that are going to be exchanged, because obviously one red table does not have the same exchange as the value of a red jacket, or the weight, a pound of, Marx's example, a pound of feathers is not the same value as a pound of gold. So color, all of these things, shape, color, weight, etc., are irrelevant. So what is it that is the relevant quality that they have in common? And for Marx, this is going to be labor, right? So it's similar to Locke's idea when he says, it's what makes property is that we transform something, we put our labor into it. Well, that's what's unique to all commodities, is that what generates them is they have a quantity of labor that it takes in order to produce them. Okay, so this brings us back to the socially necessary labor. Okay, so the trait that all commodities have that are used to measure the value within them and exchange them is the quantity of labor, but we're going to specify this in a minute, the socially necessary labor, but it's the quantity of labor that it takes to produce that commodity that determines its exchange value. All commodities take a certain amount of labor to produce them, thus they can be exchanged based on the quantity within them. You could think of it as a kind of objective quantity, similar to the way one, in physics class, sometimes you get these equations. How much work does it take to move, say, 5 pounds of whatever, 5 feet, right? You know, how much energy is required to do that? 5 pounds of bricks, for example. How much energy is required to move 5 pounds of bricks 5 feet? That's a certain quantity of energy. Well, similarly, let's say you were going to transform a brand newly chopped down piece of wood into a table, right? Well, that takes a certain amount of work. Now, someone can do that work slowly, they can do it more quickly, but nonetheless, it's a certain quantity of labor that's required to do it. So what we get is the exchange value of a commodity then is the amount of socially necessary labor on average it takes to produce it, right? So the way tables can be exchanged for jackets is by determining how many hours or quantity of labor it takes to produce both the tables and jackets. And once this is determined, let's say we can exchange, one table for 2 jackets or whatever the case may be, based solely upon the quantity of labor it takes to produce them, right? And so more specifically, the exchange value being the socially necessary labor simply means the social component is this, that it's the amount of labor required given the specific level of tools of a given society, right? And this is important, because obviously a commodity can't become more valuable just because someone works slower, right? This person took 10 hours to build the same type of table, therefore it's more valuable because it has 10 hours of labor. No. So for Marx, it's an abstraction. It's the socially necessary labor, is that what quantity of labor is necessary given the social level of development of tools and so on, equipment at their disposal, right? So you can think of it as a fixed quantity, independent about the individual and how much exertion they do. They could be working below the socially necessary labor, or they could be working faster than it, and so on. And so you might think when a society has like a metal saw, and yet someone is still cutting wood with, say, a rope, and thus it takes way longer, this person is somehow working below the socially necessary, or they're spending more socially necessary labor than is required. So ultimately, you could think the exchange value of a commodity is the quantity of socially necessary labor, that is the amount of labor necessary to produce something given the current development of the tools of production. Okay, so continuing, working our way towards understanding how surplus is extracted, we've got a commodity, we've got use value, now we have exchange value. There's another term that's very important, which is labor power. And so labor power is Marx's term for the commodity of labor. This is what a capitalist purchases from a worker. That is their labor power. What is labor power? It's what we would call the capacity, the power to do the labor, right? What humans have, what they sell on the market isn't, I don't sell my specific me version, lispy labor. No, I sell the capacity to labor. That's what a proletariat sells to a capitalist, their capacity to do labor, to move their body in specific ways, whatever the case may be. So, the worker's not purchased by the capitalist because they have nice hair or a nice smile. The worker's purchased by the capitalist because they contain this capacity to perform labor, and the capitalist is interested in purchasing that capacity and then putting it to use, right, to getting the use value of it. The use value of labor power being the labor that comes out of it. So more specifically, we can say realizing the use value of labor power just means making use of the labor, right? Putting it to work. Okay, and so labor power, so not specific labor, but this capacity to labor, that labor power is a commodity. It's a commodity just like every other commodity, and therefore labor power is something that is purchased on the market, and therefore it has to have an exchange value, right? Okay, so we already know what its use value is. We already said its use value is that we can put it to work. What's its exchange value? Okay, well, its exchange value is determined by the same things as every other commodity. namely, it's the socially necessary labor that it takes to produce it, right? Okay, but what does that mean? What exactly is that? What is that necessary labor that it takes to reproduce the commodity of labor power? Well, it depends. It's the labor it takes so that the human being can actually perform labor. Well, what is that? Well, what does a human need in order to have the capacity to do labor? What in order to produce labor, whether it be chopping wood, whether it be building tables, whatever the case may be, what does it take for us in order to have that ability? So what is this exchange value of labor power? Well, in order to perform labor at the most basic level, for right now, we can think of it as humans must be alive, right? That by virtue of being alive and being basically minimal level of health, we have the ability to labor. We have labor power, right? So humans, what do we need in order to be alive? Well, we need what Marx called the subsistence minimum. That is the most basic amount of necessities in order to survive. That is some minimum amount of, say, food, water, and shelter, right? So the exchange value of labor power is therefore the amount of socially necessary labor required to produce these subsistence minimum. In other words, it's the socially necessary labor required to produce the food, the water, and the shelter that it generally takes to keep the worker alive, right? It takes a certain amount of labor to produce the food, it takes a certain amount of labor to produce the water, it takes, and whatever the case may be, let's say. And when you put all that together, that's a quantity of labor that it takes to reproduce all those basic necessities. And whatever that quantity is would be the exchange value of labor power. That's what it takes to reproduce the commodity of labor power, right? A certain quantity of nutrients, let's say, which require a certain amount of labor. So there's not a difference, whether the commodity is tables or whether the commodity is the ability to perform labor itself. Both of those commodities share a quantity of labor necessary, socially necessary labor, a quantity of socially necessary labor required to reproduce them. Okay, so now we can move to, well, what makes up this surplus value in capitalism? So, to say it up front and then to go into a little more detail, what we'll see is there is a difference for the capitalists between the cost to purchase the labor power. So that takes a certain amount. A certain exchange is provided to the worker. Here you go. I have now purchased your labor power, and now I want to receive something from you. And what I receive from you, it too will have an exchange value. And the only way for there to be a surplus is if what I pay to purchase the labor power is less than the value received by putting that labor power to use. That's the only way, right? Exploit, in that sense, is a sort of technical term. It's to get more out of, right? To pay a certain amount for one thing and to put it to use and get more out of it, get more value out of it. So in general, this is the source of wealth under capitalism, the surplus, right? So remember, it's this exploitation of the working class that generates the wealth in the same way as the exploitation of slaves under slavery, the exploitation of the peasants. It's under feudalism is the exploitation of the working class under capitalism by extracting more value from the worker than what you paid to receive it. Well, why is the worker in this position in the first place? Well, remember, the proletariat in general has been completely separated from the means of subsistence, right? They have no access to what they need to survive. The only way they can get that access is by going to work for a wage that they can then exchange to purchase the things they need to survive. Even in order to reach that bare subsistence level, the subsistence minimum, they have to go to work and sell their labor power to get that amount. Right? So they have no other way of doing this. And so when the capitalist buys the worker's ability to labor, that means then the capitalist gets to work the worker as much as they can get away with over the course of the workday, right? If they can work them, if they can make them work faster, we can make them do more work. Great, all the more power to them, because they purchased the worker for a certain portion of time, and now it's up to them to get the most out of them during that time. And there is only a surplus, remember, if the worker gives more to the capitalist than what the capitalist paid or gave in order to purchase their labor power. If there isn't, then there is no point. So let's work our way through a kind of more, simplified example here. Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of explanation, let's fix the exchange value of labor power. Let's make it fixed. Let's say the subsistence minimum requires 2,000 calories per day, right? We're ignoring shelter and clothing, and many other necessities. But let's just say the most basic minimum is some version of 2,000 calories a day. And let's say that the socially necessary labor required to produce 2,000 calories a day is 5 hours of labor, right? That's what it takes. 5 hours of labor will produce some version of 2,000 calories. So that means, that in terms of the socially necessary labor, the exchange value of labor power is equivalent to 5 hours of labor, right? Let's keep the example simple, and let's just say 5 hours of labor is worth $10. That's what its equivalent is. So that means two things for us, right? That means that a worker can be purchased for about $10 per day, which would mean that the worker can then go buy themselves those 2,000 calories. That is, they can buy themselves the basic necessities to sustain themselves for that day, right, and be able to come back to work the next day. But what's most important to remember is that $10 is only equivalent to a certain amount of labor. We said 5 hours of labor, right? So if the capitalist agrees to hire a worker for $10 per day, as soon as that worker labors for 5 hours, they've already given back to the capitalist the equivalent of their wages. They were paid $10 for the day, and they gave back the capitalist that amount in 5 hours. But remember, they weren't buying a specific amount of labor power. They were buying this general ability to do the labor, which the capitalist owns during the course of the workday. So that means the capitalist gets to set the terms of how that labor is used, how intense it is, and for how long. So every minute they work past 5 hours is unpaid for, and they're receiving it. It's free labor in that sense. It's extra value that they're getting. So they work for 6, that's an hour over what they pay. They work for 7. How intense is it, right? How much are they producing in that amount of time? And so we could look at it, however way we look at it, the surplus value then is any value that's produced over and above the $10 per day. Okay, so let's look at a more, complex example to make sense of this. So in order to do that, we have a couple more technical terms to make sense of this. So there are elements of production that are different from labor because they don't generate any surplus value. They're fixed or constant. They don't get increased by putting them to making use of them. They don't increase the value. They just transfer portions of their value directly to the product. The value that they give remains constant, right? So it cannot be increased or decreased. So for this reason, we call it constant capital. Constant capital includes the amount of money spent on the machinery, the raw materials, and let's say, a machine costs $1 million and it can produce 10,000 cars in a year before being worn out and replaced, and you have to buy a new machine. Well, then that means in the course of a year, each one of those 10,000 cars has $100 worth of the machine in it. But notice it's a direct conversion. The machine has a certain value, and it spreads that value over time, right? So keep going. To make it simple, let's say let's say 1 hour of labor is equivalent to $1, just to make our example simple. And let's say all of the constant capital in our table that we're making, for example, is composed of wood and machinery. And let's say the wood has a certain exchange value. Let's say 1 pound of wood is equivalent to 1 hour of labor. So $1. 1 pound of wood is $1. So for every 1 pound of wood used in making a table, the table's value is, the wood contributes $1 to the table's value. Similarly, we can say something about the machinery involved in making this table. Some sort of large cutting tools, for example. The value of those is proportioned out over time, and what we need to understand is that each time it's used, a portion of the value of that machine is transferred to the product, right? So let's just say, for each table, the machine transfers 10 hours of labor. Okay, but there's another kind of capital that's more important, which is what Marx calls variable capital. It's not constant, it's not fixed. This is capital that is, money that is put up, invested, and purchased in the process of production that buys something that is variable, that is, it can be increased. So raw materials and machinery make up the portion of constant capital, but they don't make up any surplus. Only exploited labor can generate surplus. And so for this reason, labor power is not constant, because the value that it creates can be augmented or changed, right? It can be increased. And of course, depending on how many extra hours of free labor the worker works. So labor power is called variable capital, simply because the amount of value it adds to a product can vary. Workers may be paid a fixed amount for the labor power, but how much value a capitalist can squeeze out of that worker varies, right? Will the worker work 5 hours or 10 hours? Will there be any breaks? How fast will they work? All of this can vary. And so the amount of value a worker can generate is variable. Okay, so continuing with the example, let's come back and say that the overall value of the table is as follows. $10 for our 10 pounds of wood, our raw materials, our constant capital. And let's say $10 was transferred to the final table. In addition to the 10 pounds of wood, we had to use those machines, and let's say we transferred $10 worth of value in machines, another area of constant capital. And then let's say $10 more was spent for 10 hours of labor. And so the exchange value of the table is $30, right? So that's its exchange value. This is what the product will be exchanged for on the market. So where does the profit come from, right? Where in that $30 of exchange value, it takes $10, take 10 pounds of wood, which is equivalent to $10. We said it takes $10 worth of constant capital from the machine, and let's say it takes 10 hours of labor to produce it, and we said $1 of labor per hour. So it takes 10 hours labor to produce it. You add all that together, the exchange value of the table is $30, but where's the profit? And so the profit cannot come from the constant capital. It can't come from the raw material or machines. It can only come from the only element in the equation that is variable, the labor power. So where does it come from? The question is, those 10 hours of labor that we said were necessary, how much were paid for them? If the capitalist pays $10 to the worker for 10 hours of labor, well, guess what? The capitalist will make no profit, and the entire effort would be a complete waste of time. The profit, the surplus value, comes from whatever free labor the capitalist received from the worker. So remember, the capitalist only paid for the ability for the worker to work, but the capitalist tries to use that labor power as much as possible to get the worker to work as much as possible. So if the capitalist only paid the equivalent of, say, 5 hours of labor, $5, then the capitalist would make 100% profit. They received 5 hours for free. So surplus value is the difference between the exchange value of labor power, what they paid for this labor power, and the actual use of the labor power. How much labor does the capitalist receive over and above what they paid for it? Surplus value is generated when the capitalist receives more from the worker in labor than what the capitalist paid. The capitalist is buying labor power, that capacity to labor, but they get as much as possible from that labor. So contained within that table being worth $30, the portion that was devoted towards surplus capital, that 10 hours of labor, everything they paid less than $10 for that is their profit. Okay, so this brings us to what Marx calls the rate of exploitation. That is that rate, that how big is that difference? So the rate of exploitation is a measurement of how much surplus value is extracted. How great is this difference between the amount paid for the labor power and the value from the labor received. And it's important to just point out there's no real bottom limit to how little capitalists can pay for labor. The more desperate the workers are, the cheaper their labor. The limit is really the most basic level of subsistence. Imagine a working class that just survives on Red Bulls and Snickers, right? These workers would be very cheap, inexpensive, right? Their exchange value would be very low. There's been instances where a whole labor force building, like installing fiber optic cable in some place, there are these migrant laborers and they set up tent camps and they basically don't feed them and they don't pay them till the end, so they eat off of whatever they can catch in their tents on the side of the work site, and workers eating ants and rodents, whatever they can catch. So really that basic level of subsistence is the only limit. The workers have to stay alive. Obviously, if the working class died by the end of the workday, well, they couldn't be hired the next day. So there's a kind of bottom limit, but it's very, very low. The only limit is they have to sort of basically be able to survive on some low level of existence. Anyway, so the workers are cheap, inexpensive, and therefore their exchange value is low. And that's why really we see this tendency to make the means of subsistence increasingly cheap, right? So the cost of reproducing the worker becomes cheaper. So, and it can go even lower, right? So it's no accident, for example, that things like caffeine and fast food, processed grains, converting corn into some sort of sugar. What this really is cheap energy, right? And the reason these things have become so common and necessary in the capitalist system for the working class is because it allows for a very cheap working class. So not only are these things cheap to produce, and so they're able to be sold in large quantities, but when the working class subsists on this cheap energy, in fact, the result is the working class becomes cheaper. Okay, so there's no real bottom limit to how little can be paid for labor power, but also Marx points out there's no real upper limit for how much for how much work a capitalist can get from a worker. Only death and complete exhaustion would be the main limits, right? A capitalist can purchase labor power, and then the workday can be a non-stop, super intense 8 or 10 or 12 or more hours. Think of how capitalists have very little tolerance at work for downtime, right? You're not being paid to stand still, get to work. They want to keep you working because you've been paid for that time. They want to extract as much out of you as possible. Even Amazon has put to use this tracking technology on their employees in the warehouses to track their movements in the warehouse, see how fast they are and how frequent they move. There was, it even monitors during bathroom breaks. I read about UPS has a technology on all of its vans, where the drivers are driving around to not just track the route of a driver, but it actually tracks how long they're sitting while stopped and how long they leave the truck and so on, because there's scales on the weights of these chairs that determine is there a human body in it or not. So it tests, okay, the vehicle's not moving. Are they moving, or are they just sort of using this as downtime? Are they hopping out of the vehicle and coming back in? So all of that can be measured and tracked, because again, that leads to a higher surplus value if you keep them working constantly and get more out of them. So all this is just to make sure that the quantity of labor extracted from the worker is as great as possible. But, to say again, there is a minimum limit to how much a worker must perform for the capitalist. There's a minimum, so there's not a maximum of how much they can get out of the worker. There's not a minimum for how much they can pay them, but there is a minimum limit of how much work a worker must perform for the capitalist. If a worker does not give the capitalist more than the capitalist paid for their labor, then it's a wasted exchange because there's no surplus value created. There is no profit. So there is a necessity, right, based on competition, for the capitalist to extract as much labor as possible from all workers and to pay as little as possible for that labor. That is not a choice. That's not motivated by the motivation of greed. That is a basic component to the capitalist production process, the need for the highest rate of exploitation. And through making workers, whether that's through making workers work faster or for paying less for the labor, all of these things can increase the rate of exploitation, right? And we also see mechanization, innovation through, say, mechanization. This usually aids in increasing the speed of the work and thereby also can increase sometimes the rate of exploitation. So, in a certain way, it's important to think of labor power almost as kind of this magical thing then, It's like, I was thinking about the story of Rumpelstiltskin. He's doing this magical thing by somehow, okay, he creates gold out of straw, but what does he really do? He performs a certain labor, and at the result of that labor, there's more value than what it began, right? So in a certain way, labor power is sort of like this Rumpelstiltskin-like magical commodity that by putting it to work, since it is the measurement of all value, it can generate more value. And so, anyway, I just think it's an interesting way to compare the two. But what we want to take away from this rate of exploitation is that what determines that rate, right? What determines how much a capitalist gets or how little they pay for it? And for Marx, this was one component of the class struggle. So, capitalists compete on the market to accumulate as much profit as possible. Of course, their main advantage in that competition is to reduce the cost of production while extracting as much surplus as possible, to try to produce it as cheaply as possible. And obviously, if the capitalists could get away with it, they'd pay nothing in wages and have workers work 24 hours a day. But it's important to see why this isn't possible, right? So as we said above, there are real psychological and physiological limits to how much a worker can work, before they start to deteriorate. And so when workers are pushed beyond their limits, we see death and injuries, of course, go up. So for example, several years ago, workers in a Foxconn plant in China that helped assemble components of the iPhone were worked so much at work that there was increasing suicides. They died by suicide at work. And so there's a limit to the rate of exploitation that's physiological. But this limit is not simply death, injury, and exhaustion. Working class are not a bunch of robots. They're real human beings who not enjoy being exploited without limit. Workers fight back and resist. And workers fight for more pay. They fight for better working conditions. They fight for less hours. And so all of this, what really ultimately, therefore, determines the rate of exploitation is what's called the class struggle. How well organized and to what degree of resistance does the working class exert, and that will determine how low the rate of exploitation will go. We're seeing this right now play out in Bessemer, Alabama, with the Amazon workers there who've started to organize against the conditions, against their pay, mostly started by women in the workforce there. Their pathway to trying to reduce this or resist and reduce the exploitation is to try to form some kind of a union so they can push back collectively. And this is, not unique to the current moment. It's been the history of capitalism, been part of it. And so because of this, endless opposition between workers and capitalists, really the history of capitalism is, a component of it is the history of this endless struggle between the workers and the capitalists for how high or low this rate of exploitation will go. How high or low will the surplus value be extracted? Sometimes this struggle happens with many defeats. Other times it breaks out into fierce battles in the cities, battles in factories, battles in whole towns, turns into civil war, and it ultimately turns into revolutionary periods. But the class struggle cannot eliminate exploitation under capitalism. The only way to end the exploitation is to end capitalism. That is a revolutionary transformation of society. But, the workers aren't the only ones conscious of this, of course. We see here, this is from 06, the ruling class, the capitalists are conscious of it as well. This was an interesting, in addition to the Warren Buffett quote, this was what this CEO of Carl's Jr. said back in 2016, when there was, a minor effort among fast food workers to raise the minimum wage. It's interesting to see what the CEO said. He said, when asked about it, he said, "Does it really matter if Sally makes $3 more an hour if Susie has no job?" And what does that mean? So Sally gets a raise of $3, but now the only way they're going to do that is if another person has no job. If you're making labor more expensive and automation less expensive, this is not rocket science. So what the CEO of Carl's Jr. is saying is, look, the question of the minimum wage for the capitalist isn't the most important question. For them, what's necessary, whether the minimum wage goes up, stays the same, or even goes down, is the only way to make a profit is to get more out of the workers than they spend to purchase their labor. And so if the cost of workers go up by some sort of mandate, he's saying, well, what I'm going to do as CEO will just use innovation, automation, and hire less workers. So my overall cost of labor can stay roughly the same or even go down. I'll just pay less of them. I won't pay as many workers. So go ahead, raise your minimum wage. I'll try and move around it this way. And as a small detour, I want to show that this is sort of playing out in another industry, in the garment industry. So for a while, China was, one of the main sort of hubs for the garment industry, production of shoes or clothing, textiles, right? But at the same time, during this period, these massive cities with multiple factories of 10,000, 20,000 workers in these districts, all working in production of jeans or the production of shoes, there had been a rise of strikes year after year for about 4 years in a row, and it did lead to workers' wages in some cases going up, but it also meant that this workforce wasn't the most reliable for some of these industries. And this here is a picture from a 2014 strike of Adidas workers in China. And so then around 2015, the garment industry kind of moved less, a little bit less in China and more in Bangladesh. But then you started to have resistance to conditions there. One happened because of a factory collapsed and killed a bunch of workers. And so it led to a series of strikes involving tens of thousands of workers. Companies shut down. And so the nature of this garment industry work is that a lot of these factories are just shells for machines that are brought in. So it makes them a little more mobile, and they can be easily closed down and moved elsewhere. So, as it moved from China to, say, India, from India to Bangladesh, the new kind of main epicenter became Ethiopia, primarily because the class struggle in these other cases were able to push back against the conditions. Workers weren't willing to work at that pace, perhaps, that level of exploitation. You compare Ethiopia to the wages in Bangladesh or India, it's much cheaper. And so what we see here is that, but what's happening is workers are resisting and pushing back. There's no reason why we're not going to see strikes among workers in Ethiopia next. But what the capitalists are saying now is, because for a long time there wasn't a lot of innovation in the garment industry because labor and wages were so cheap, right? But what's happening is, because of the conditions of the class struggle and workers fighting back, it's forced the capitalists to think about other means. And so now they're thinking, well, maybe there's new changes in robotics and so on, so maybe there's an opening for them to innovate and just not require as many workers. And so this was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple years ago arguing that automation is finally cheap enough, and there's more of a reason to do it because workers are resisting. Their wages are becoming more expensive, so now there's an incentive to bring innovation into the garment industry, and it might even mean, that the garment industry can come back to the United States because they're not going to require as many laborers anyway. So the need for a high rate of exploitation among the workers is less because it's going to be so mechanized. Anyway, this is all part of the class struggle, that pushback against the rate of exploitation. The capitalists trying to adapt and find some new means. Much more to say, but obviously we don't have time. So in addition, it's important to understand the state sort of in the context of the class struggle. So for Marx, understanding the class struggle is also useful to understand more clearly the role of the state. Yes, it's the executive committee to navigate and to deal with all the different affairs of the bourgeoisie. Well, guess what one of those affairs is to deal with the class struggle. And so the role of the state, the government, the police, even the judicial system, the military system, the prison system, all of this takes on a much clearer role when we see its use in the class struggle. Wherever workers go on strike, you see them met with the police, you see them met with the courts. If the strike gets bigger, they'll try to use the military, whoever else they can. And so the capitalists, by being, this minority class whose power rests upon exploitation of majority, it puts them in a kind of vulnerable position in that sense. And this working class is a population with an immense potential power because it runs the whole society, and which is sometimes this power is expressed. And so therefore the role of the police in those moments in disciplining the working class and discouraging it from organizing, from trying to push back against it, becomes very clear. And so the overall function of the state is to maintain the capitalist system and to keep it functioning, and of course to put down any kind of rebellion or instability that comes out of the pushback against the exploitation, that is the class struggle. So we could return, to a kind of new twist on Madison's old quote, the function of the state, yes, it is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, and the class struggle is the instrument for the majority to protect the majority. And so the state is used in that battle. And so the state really is the instrument of the protection of the minority of the ruling class against the working class. That's its instrument. And we can also have some things to say about inequality. So, for Locke, he had his whole explanation of inequality. What we see here with this analysis of capitalism and understanding how profit is generated allows us to have a much more clear picture of understanding the overall functioning of capitalism. And this provides an answer to Locke and an answer to Smith and all those who justified inequality before them. So, Locke justified inequality by explaining that the problem was the result of the individual. Some were less industrious than others, some worked harder than others. Smith took inequality for granted, but he argued that, wealth generated at the top would over time sort of trickle down to some degree to the bottom. What Marx is showing is that inequality is built into the very process of production under capitalism. That is, it's built into the very process of generating profit to begin with. It's not industrious that generates wealth, it's exploitation. Right? Wealth does not trickle down because the very process of generating wealth requires generating poverty on the other end. So in other words, capitalism depends on inequality. It reproduces inequality, increases inequality overall. And so there's no surprise, say for today, that we're living in a period of the largest inequality ever recorded. Similarly, we can have something to say about this analysis of capitalism allows us to say something about unemployment. So by depriving more and more people from access to the means of subsistence, right, it means that there are ever increasing numbers of population that are thrown into the ranks of the proletariat. It's what we called last time proletarianization. Right? Take away people's land, take away people's access to what they need to survive. It means they have to find work in order to survive. But at the same time, the overall capitalist system can only employ, a portion of the total available working class population. So what that means is there is always a surplus population, right? There's always, that is, a quantity of jobs needed to be performed and a greater quantity of people who can perform them. And the difference between those two is the surplus population, the unemployed. And that's a permanent feature. That's not we're told unemployment is due to laziness or somebody not trying hard enough to find a job. That's how it gets internalized. But in fact, no, it's just a permanent feature of capitalists trying to get the work done with as few people as possible. And there are more people than capitalists need to employ to make a profit. If they put them all to work and everyone worked less, there would be no more unemployment, but capitalists wouldn't make any money, obviously. There was a 2017 research study gave us kind of global view of this surplus population. So they looked at what they call prime age workers, people from prime age where you're still able to work, ages 25 to 54. And the number globally was around 3.8 billion people and of prime age workers around the globe. And so therefore the employed population, that is, of that 3.8 billion, how many of those were employed with regular employment was around only 37%. Right? So the surplus population, that is the number of prime age workers with no employment or precarious employment, maybe it's only for short stints here or there, was 63%. So that's pretty big, right, for the population as a whole on the global scale. And capitalists benefit from a large surplus population, or they benefit from unemployment in general, in the sense that it means there's a greater competition for jobs. Right? It means that within the social surplus population, potential workers can grow more desperate for access to the means of subsistence, and they'll be more willing to work for less, right? Far below the exchange value of labor. And what will this do? Nothing but increase the rate of exploitation, right? The more people there are in the surplus, the more competition for those jobs, the more need there are for those jobs, and thereby the more desperate those will become, and the rate of exploitation can increase. Migration from one place to another is often a necessary feature of the social surplus population. That is, those who in the working class must flee their city or county or continent, right, in order to find access to the means of survival. What we're seeing, and we'll talk about in another unit, is that it's not just, of course, the economy that puts people into the surplus population, but now we're seeing, not just military conflicts separate people from means of subsistence, but also climate change. Climate change is one of the largest causes for increased migration. But all of that falls under the surplus population, the unemployed, those people who need to compete on the market for getting a job. And what happens to the surplus population, this growing surplus population? Well, Engels wrote about this in 1845 in his book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And he used the term social murder to describe the impact on the surplus population. That is, the number of people who are cast into the ranks of the surplus population. They make up those who are unhoused, those who live in the shanty towns, the slums, those who have to beg just to survive and barely eke out an existence, those who have to turn to crimes of poverty as a result from the existence of being in the surplus population. That is, those who need to steal in order to survive. Those who have no access to healthy meals or health care or dental, who suffer from malnutrition, right? All of these things afflict the surplus population. And of course, prisons become one, not the only, but a major dumping ground for portions of this surplus population. This was the theme, if you remember. Next time you watch A Christmas Carol, see if they put that exchange that was in the original. The line goes in the play that Ebenezer Scrooge, he's explaining how he understands the purpose of prison as this dumping ground for the poor and unemployed. He's asked, the people come by and ask him to give a donation, and he doesn't want to give one, and then they ask him, well, what should be done to the poor? And he answers, are there no prisons? ? Are there no prisons? Those who are badly off must go there. And then the questioner replies, many can't go there, and many would rather die. And Scrooge replies, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. But he's like, throw them in jail. I don't want to give them money, just throw them in jail. And then he's like, they don't want to go to jail, they'd rather die. Well, great, let them die. Either way, we have a decrease in the surplus population. That was all the way back in 1843, already a very clear understanding of what happens to the social surplus population. So what we see in this analysis of Capitalism by Marx is that it reveals that all these phenomena, employment, poverty, those that are unhoused, malnutrition, incarceration, even migration, these are all permanent features of the capitalist system. They're not due to individual problems. They're part of capitalism. And it's why it brings us to the question of reform or revolution. It's Marx's analysis of capitalism that reveals the necessity for revolution. Right? The worst aspects of capitalism, whether it's poverty, misery, the exploitation, the militarism, the war for competition of resources, all of these are just permanent features of the capitalist system. And yes, workers can fight back to occasionally blunt the edge of this exploitation. Of course, you can win demands like better education, some welfare relief, but overall, the problems remain and return, and they continue to spread internationally because they are part and parcel of capitalism. And so the only way to put an end to these problems is through a revolution to bring about a completely different economic system that doesn't have these problems within it, that isn't based off of exploitation, that isn't have the feature where the means of production and the means of subsistence are owned privately for their own individual betterment. If you got rid of those things, only then could you begin to get rid of the features of capitalism that generate poverty and misery and exploitation and all these things. That's why, for Marx, reforms are things to fight for, but ultimately, the only way to really address these problems is through revolution.